for your pleat sewing. So my whole back piece is sewn except for this section, and that's fine because I kind of have it like my structure already down. I'm gonna immediately select both of my pattern pieces and strengthen them, and then just simulate so that they stiff up and I can see both of my pleated areas. Then I'm going to select first my first line. Usually you'll have 3 lines. The first one is the direction of the pleat, and then the second one is the inside of the pleat, and you'll have similar markings as to my pattern. The first one, depending on what direction you want the pleat to go, the easiest way of doing this is just to turn simulation on and change the fold angle on and like look on the screen of what direction you want the pleat to go in. So it looks like this is going in, so I actually want it to be at 0 so that the pleat will go out and fold to the left. I'm going to select the inside line now, and this one was 0. I want the opposite of that, which is 360, so I know my other line has to be 360. And when I change it, my pleat is going the direction that I want it to. So that's the logic of your tucks or your pleats. It's always one line will be either 0 or 360, and then the other line will be the opposite number. This last line you don't really need. It's just an indication of where the pleat will meet, and you'll keep it at 180 degrees. So once I've folded it, I can now sew it down. And sewing is, you're gonna start at the angle and then sew out, and you're gonna just sew the different sides of the angle to each other. And I'm used to doing it in 2D, but if you wanted to, you can also sew in the 3D window. But so this is the line where my pleat is, and this is the inside of the angle. I'm gonna click and sew out with my free sewing tool, and then click again to sew out on the other side. And that creates my first sewing relationship. And again, I need to sew the second part of my pleat to the pattern. I'm going to start on the inside corner, sew out, and start in the inside corner and sew out. And I'm going to turn simulation on to see if my sewing is correct, which it should be. And then the last thing about pleat sewing is that you want to, I'm going to use my edit sewing tool to select my sewing lines. You want your sewing line type to be turned. If you remember from the sewing videos, that if you have pattern pieces on top of each other and sewn together, it's better to turn the sewing type to turned. This just means that they're not going to be ironed out flat like a side seam would be, but they're going to be turned out like a pocket, for example. For this instance, these pleats, all these different layers are on top of each other, sewed together, so I do want it to be turned just so that I can decrease that puffiness that will happen. And it's like a small thing, but it does make a difference once you go into high res. Alright, and now I'm going to right click and unstrengthen, and there's my pleat. I can now sew this entire thing to the yoke. Cool, there we go. And if you decide you don't need these lines anymore, you can always turn the fold rendering off or delete them. Sometimes I like to just decrease the length of the inner fold just so I don't see that little line. But if you want a really soft fold or a soft tuck, you can always just delete these as well. So now that we've done it the manual way, I'm going to explain the pleat sewing and pleats fold tools, which are a more automatic way of doing it, but it's better to understand the logic of the angles and why one is 360, one is 0, etc. before you actually use these tools. These are super helpful for if you're trying to do multiple tucks or like a pleated skirt or something, and you have a lot of internal lines to deal with, but generally you only have one or two, and it's pretty easy to manually change the fold angle. But if we want to learn how to use these tools, we can. I'm going to just delete my pleat sewing, and I'm going to change my internal line angles back to 180. We're just going to start from the beginning. You can open up your file again if you want, instead of doing it this way. Let's just start fresh. And I have to delete the sewing as well. Okay. And I'm going to strengthen this again, just so everything is flat and nicely laid out for me. So the pleat fold tool and the pleat sewing tool, the pleats fold tool will automatically assign different fold angles to all of your internal lines. And that's cool because you don't have to select each line separately and do it. To use it, you just click on it and you're gonna select the lines you're gonna use, and then you're gonna go in a direction that you want to fold. So to select your lines, I'm gonna first click on one side of all of the lines, so on the right side, and then you get this line, this arrow, and you're gonna cross over all of your internal lines and then double click on the other side. A pleats fold box will appear that will ask you if you want knife pleats, box pleats, or accordion pleats. And in this video, we're just doing basic pleating, so we're not going to go into box pleats, but this would be a knife pleat. And the number of internal lines per pleat, this just means, does your pattern have just the two lines as markings, or do you have the 3 lines including the one that you don't use, which is the 180 degrees flat line? And since I have 3 lines, I'm going to select 3, and you'll notice that my first line will turn red, my second one will turn blue, and my last one is the normal internal line color. Like I said before, I know this is correct because if it's a bright red line, that means my angle is less than 180 degrees, and if it's a blue line, then my angle is over 180 degrees. I'm going to hit OK and just simulate to see if this is correct, and it is. So that got us to where we were before when we were manually changing the fold angles, but in order to use this tool, you do have to understand why each fold angle value is the way it is and how to do it manually first. So that's why I explained it the other way. Now we're going to do our sewing, and the pleat sewing tool is the more complicated tool. It automatically sews one segment to 3 segments. If you notice, your pleat is made out of 3 segments. I'm going to use my edit pattern tool to click on it. So 1, 2, 3. You should have a point separating each segment where the lines are intersecting. If you don't have a point there, you can select the end of your line and choose extend/trim and add point to pattern outline so that it creates your different segments. The tool isn't smart enough to automatically group your pleat together unless you separate it into these segments. Same with the above. It'll automatically sew. So for example, if I sew, click end, then click at the end, and then I click here, it's grouping those 3 segments to 1, but it's not smart enough to know how, like, wide that first section should be. So you do have to split up your lines into segments that are equal. To do that, I want to measure how big my pleat actually is. I'm going to use my edit pattern tool and just click on it and attach to my cursor, and on the line is how